want to be profitable, and in order to be profitable, they would want to reduce their costs, increase their efficiency, and we encouraged them to do that. And the way that we did that was to adopt an approach that was different from the United States regulation. We said, we will specify a price for, let us say, 5 years. If you can reduce your costs in that 5-year period, we shall not take that away from you. But after the 5 years, we shall share those benefits with customers. And this price cap was related to inflation, the Retail Price Index, RPI. And that was because no private investor could afford to be exposed to inflation and the threat that a regulator would not allow that inflation to be passed through. So that was the thinking behind this price cap, that we tried to reflect the interests of investors and we tried to reflect the interest of customers as well. Now, what have been the achievements of this regime in the UK? Well, take, for example, an approximately 15-year period. The distribution company operating costs have reduced on average by 5.5% each year. In transmission, about 3% each year. To give one illustration of the kinds of cost savings, within about 10 years, the workforce in this industry was at about 1/3 of the level that it was at the time of privatization. And that is producing a higher output with higher quality of service. Many people feared that there would be less investment, that private companies would not wish to invest in the sector. In fact, the opposite has been the case. Roughly speaking, the annual capital expenditure in this sector since privatization has been double what it was in the years before privatization. Now, this increased capital expenditure has nonetheless been consistent with reducing prices. For example, in the 10 years that I was regulating, very roughly, the average bill for a customer reduced from £350 per year to £250. I have to say things have changed since then. The average bill for electricity is now about £600, mainly due to increases in fuel prices and the costs, the higher costs of renewable energy. We'll come to those a bit later. But the service quality has increased. There are now about 11% fewer power cuts, and the average duration of a power cut is 30% shorter. So all these, it seems to me, are achievements that would not have been possible in the absence of privatization and competition and regulation. But I want to indicate that regulation alone isn't sufficient by looking at the island of Guernsey, which is just off the coast of Britain. It's a relatively affluent island. It's a very small island. The electricity utility there is regulated by an independent regulator, but it's still in public ownership. And what we have seen over the last 10 and 15, maybe even 20 years, is repeated conflicts between that company and the regulator. And the company alleges that the regulator simply doesn't explain what it's doing, what it's going to do. It holds the price too low because it's politically popular to have low prices. It's politically unpopular to increase them. And because this is a government-owned company, it has been willing to accept this. It hasn't needed to make a profit that a private company would. And the situation has become so bad, even in this very small island, that 2 independent investigations have been called for by parties from outside the island. They have all found delays in the way that the regulator makes decisions. They find that the regulator's decisions are unclear and unreasonable. And what I suggest is that this regulatory conduct, which has not been satisfactory, would not have been possible if the company had been in private ownership. And the reason is you simply cannot sustain private ownership if you have poor regulation. One or other would have to go. And it seems to me that in the UK we recognise this. The government said we need to privatise this sector because we need new investment, the point that the Minister made this morning. We need more investment than the government can provide. We also need better management, and we need to look at what conditions will bring that about. But at the same time, we need to make sure that what happens in the sector is acceptable to customers and there is not objection to it. So we have to ask, what do investors need as well as what do customers need? And as I've mentioned, the main requirement in the UK is that the investors could pass through inflation and that they would be allowed to earn a reasonable return on their investment. And it was specifically written into the Act of Parliament that the regulator had a duty to allow a reasonable return on investment. But there was more than that, I think. In the UK, it was accepted that you would only get a well-managed sector if the government limited its role to a very relatively small and important aspects. There were not a multitude of other bodies advising what the policy should be in the industry. It was basically the regulator and the government. The regulator was in fact independent of the government, unlike some countries where the regulator makes recommendations to the government. In the UK, the regulator makes decisions. The regulator is responsible and reports to Parliament and not to the government. There are processes laid down for regulatory decisions. They have to be consulted on, explained, and so on. And quite importantly, the regulator could not impose a decision on the company. If it wanted to change the license, to put in place a new price control, for example, it had to propose a change to the company. The company could accept, and then the regulator could enforce this. But if the company did not accept, then the issue would go to the Competition Commission to decide between the arguments of the regulator and the arguments of the company. And there were also possibilities of appealing it in court. So this limited power for the regulator meant that it was more acceptable to the private sector, and therefore we got all the investment we needed. Now, I want to illustrate once more what seems to me the importance of ownership by looking at a very different country in India, where I think it's fair to say most of the electricity utilities in India, at least until recently, have not been well run. And I think they would accept that. They have been inefficient. They have nonetheless low prices because they are kept down for political reasons. But it's also meant low investment. They have not had access to funds. The quality of service has been poor. There have been very high financial losses and very high technical losses. Many people in India simply do not pay electricity bills. Delhi was the exception. They privatized the 3 distribution businesses there. What they have seen, and I give just one example, is a very significant reduction in technical losses. These were the results for the 3 companies over the last 10 years. And you can see the magnitude of the changes from, say, 53% to 13%, and similarly for the